Okay, so thank you for the intro. Thank you for having me. I thought I'd just run through the executive viewpoint because we speak a lot with executives, board members, heads of security, and this is very relevant for any industry, but I'll start with a bit of a lens into the maritime side of things. Now, I don't know if the others are going to talk about the economy side of cyber, but it's very expensive, right? So focused or looks like it's going to cost the world about 6 trillion and about 10.5 trillion by 2025, and measured as a country, it's going to be more expensive than most other countries' economies, except for the US and China. And it'll be exponentially larger than most of the natural disasters that we experience nowadays, which is why it's such a big thing, no matter what industry you're looking at. And it's something we're seeing across the industry, particularly in the various roles that I've had. It's also very lucrative, right? So cyber criminals can earn anywhere from 42K US to about $2 million a year. And the risk reward for them is extremely high. On the average, only about 0.05% of cyber criminals ever get caught, which is compared to traditional crime, extremely low. I think traditional criminals normally get caught more like 20-30% of the time. So the risk of getting caught as a cyber criminal is extremely low. And if you can go after high value targets, then it's much more profitable, which is why you're seeing the rise of ransomware specifically. And for these prices, anyone can be a cyber criminal today, right? It costs as little as $20 a month to start perpetuating or perpetrating cybercrime, and as much as 250K. Now, the reason that costs 250K is because it's a lot harder to exploit an iOS system, given what Apple does to their security compared to some of the other things you see on here. But point being, you don't need to be a technical expert to be a cyber criminal, which means one thing that started to happen is people sometimes accidentally go after things and cause damage that they didn't intend. I think if you look at the Colonial Pipeline issue in the US not too long ago, it was literally a few weeks ago. If you look at the fallout from that, apparently the criminals that perpetrated that and caused all the damage and claimed the ransomware didn't intend to cause all the damage that ended up happening. They were just after profit. So for the most part, the people doing this don't really know what they're doing. But the people who really do know what they're doing are the ones making money selling tools and selling their wares and getting very sophisticated about it. And in the maritime industry, the most, for anyone who doesn't recognize this is Denmark, Copenhagen specifically. AP Moller Maersk a couple of years ago got hit with the NotPetya ransomware, and it shut down their operations for months at a time, mainly because there was a lot of fallout that they didn't actually account for and they weren't really prepared for, right? So it's a really good article in Wired, if you go search for it, as to how that article unfolded or how that incident unfolded for AP Moller Maersk, which is obviously in the industry we're talking about. Very briefly, it started out as a bunch of computers at headquarters starting to have the ransomware message. It turned black, and then when they rebooted it, it said this machine is now locked. You need to pay X number of ransom dollars in Bitcoin, and then we will unlock the computers. And it started spreading. It eventually hit the whole of AP Moller Maersk and a lot of other industries around the world. What that effectively did was shut down Maersk's global operations, which meant they had to go to pen and paper operations, which meant logistically they actually couldn't function as a company for about 2 weeks because all the digital methods were shut down. And in the forensics, it actually came up as it was an accounting piece of software that was written by a Ukrainian company in some part of the Ukraine that hit one of their ports that then spread to the rest of the company. So that's where this whole supply chain part of it is very important when it comes to managing cyber risk. And that's where cyber as a global holistic risk for any company needs to be managed at the top level, because it really is a impactful thing for the business. In fact, the chairman said it in the end, it costs AP Moller Maersk about $300 million, and it's time to stop being naive when it comes to cyber. So particularly in this industry we're talking about, there's a lot of cyber physical aspects. So in cyber, we start to, one emerging area is operational technology, because anytime something gets cyber physical, meaning there's a digital means to get to a physical system that can cause physical disruption. That's where operational technology comes in. So for maritime, it's your ships, it's your control systems, it's your ports, it's your anything that's got a moving vehicle, anything that lets a vehicle in and out. Even with Maersk, for example, I think one of their a lot of their ports in where they owned, specifically one in New Jersey, from the forensics, was they couldn't even let the trucks in because the system that was letting the trucks in couldn't actually function. So the trucks in New Jersey at the port there were just backed up for kilometers and kilometers. All right, that was one example. So it's literally anything that is going to be part of your business ecosystem that can get shut down in the context of logistics and maritime. And so I know we're very interested in maritime specifically here, but pretty much any time there's a physical system, which people start to get very, very nervous. And the reason the risk is so high when it comes to operational technology is because it's not traditionally a connected environment, but because of the rise of IoT and the way cyber is today, those are generally the least protected environments, but can cause the most damage that if a hacker gets to, can cause, in this example, $300 million worth of damage. Now, that's the premise and the context for why cybersecurity really is a board and executive level issue today. But the problem is, no matter what industry you talk about, specifically in industries that are not used to talking about cyber, there's a disconnect between the cyber team and everyone else. And there are some stats in here that I'll share with you with a study that I was very involved with in one of my prior roles. And actually, right now, we as Avertro are actually conducting another study just to get a different view of the world as to what really is this disconnect. We'll share that those results in a couple of weeks. We're still in the midst of doing the analysis. The problem is cybersecurity metrics are generally very, very technical, right? So for those of you who aren't technical, if you look at these metrics, which is very commonly what the security operations team will report to anyone, most of them don't make sense for a non-technical audience. So how are you supposed to quantify and qualify what the number of intrusion attempts you've had in the environment over the last 2 days means from a business standpoint? Is 50,000 good? Is 50,000 bad? What is good? Like, so what? And that is the core of the issue of why cybersecurity is so difficult to understand and so difficult to communicate to non-technical audiences. 5 or so years ago, it didn't really matter as much because we didn't have the proliferation of IoT and the connected world that we have nowadays. And secondarily, that meant businesses didn't care as much as they do today. So now we've got this disconnect where businesses absolutely care. It can do real damage to businesses, but the security teams are not well equipped to actually communicate what it is to the C-level. And ultimately, based on the study I referred to a few years ago, it comes out of these 4 things. If you want to just take something, it's being able to articulate the threats and the impacts to the business from a cyber standpoint in plain language, right? So if you take the Maersk thing, the plain language was literally all our ports will be shut down. We can't have any digital systems. Trucks will be backed up for miles. It's nothing technical, but you can actually understand what it means for the business, because from that, you can actually, if you're Maersk, okay, extrapolate from that. What does it mean for Maersk if we can't do any of these things on a day-to-day basis, right? And then be able to get down to, okay, if it's costing us X amount per day to not be able to function this way, what does it mean for us over the span of a week or for 2 weeks or even more? And that lets you prioritize how you actually deal with things. In terms of being able to communicate, it has to be brief and targeted. Financial costs, impacts are absolutely important because that's the only way you're going to be able to quantify and prioritize what cyber means for the C-level. And then it helps to have an independent viewpoint of some sort that is defensible, be it a algorithmically, mathematically driven way of coming up with numbers, or using an independent source like, for example, a consulting firm, which can sometimes help in some cases. I mean, I'm a consultant, so I've been in those situations where I've been there as the independent source doing it, but it's not the only answer you can have. The point is it has to be independent so that there is some level of objective view of what you're trying to articulate, right? And when we asked, so this comes from a McAfee study that I ran with when I was in McAfee role a couple of years ago. What are the most important metrics to communicate? Ultimately, it's about organizational metrics, some of which I've talked about. And so risk and controls are financial. All the things our cyber people think are important are actually not, right? Which is what the data is telling us. And in terms of what executives and boards need answered, it's really the why and what. Like, why do I care? And so what? So why do we care about cyber risks? What are the assets we're trying to protect? What are these actual cyber risks? What are our capabilities currently to protect against those risks? What are the outcomes and goals? And if you're saying we're not at those outcomes and goals, then what are the gaps? At an exec level, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint, this is what they really care about. And if a cyber team can't answer this, as you got no hope of communicating anything you're trying to communicate to the decision makers in the business to get your point across and actually defend your position and ask for what you need to be able to protect them, right? And in terms of the how and when, it's about measuring, it's about being able to articulate, okay, we're doing X amount, we're spending X amount. Is that enough? If it's not enough, how are we going to close those gaps? How do we know we're actually spending the right amount, right? That's how you build a business case. For example, you might actually need as a cyber team 20 million to get from A to B, but you're only being given $5 million. How do you communicate the $15 million gap you need in budget to get there? Or if there's a disconnect, maybe you can only get 10. How do you get the 10? And how do you communicate that only getting 10 instead of 20, there are certain things we're sacrificing? And then how do we know when we got there and when will we get there? Cyber teams are very, very terrible at actually articulating these things. And these are parts of the issues that we need to solve in terms of communicating cyber to non-technical folks. So to summarize those few slides, ultimately, cyber teams need to be able to answer the why and the so what questions, explain in plain language. Don't get into the detail unless it adds to the actual story you're telling. Being able to forecast is critical, because if you can't say when you're going to get there, how you're going to get there, and what things are going to look like in a year, you're basically just providing point in time views of the world. And you're generally going to be a 5-minute thing where you're the cyber agenda item. You come in, you do your thing, you get out, and they forget what you said, right? Justify and right size to spend and validate what you're doing is right. Because for boards and executives, if I want to crystallize it and be very blunt, all cyber risk it's about managing risk. That's it. If you can't articulate about what risks are managing in cyber, nobody's going to care, especially at those levels. And if you don't speak in the language of risk, which is what boards and execs speak in, then cyber is not going to be anything they want to care about or even understand. For example, so for those of you in the audience who are technical, we're very used to seeing things like there are 500 vulnerabilities in our cloud infrastructure that need to be addressed, right? Or we have a fleet of servers that have not been patched for three months. Now, technical people understand what this means, right? But do business people understand what this means? And even if they do, is 500 good? Is 500 bad? If we're unpatched for 3 months, what does that mean? And the test really is like, so what, right? So the answer for the so what, for example, if you've got 500 vulnerabilities, maybe the fact that we've got 500 vulnerabilities means we have an increased risk of exfiltration of sensitive data stored in the cloud, which may mean we get fined. So the way you articulate that to a board or exec is in the bottom half of the slide. We do not articulate that with the top half of the slide. Unfortunately, most of the time, we're trying to articulate this problem using the top half of the slide. With the other example, it might be the risk actually is about system unavailability, which means we can't process customer financial transactions. That's what matters. That's a so what. It's not that we haven't patched our servers for 3 months. So for boards and execs, this is how you're supposed to report it, not the fact we have 500 vulnerabilities or we have 3 months worth of unpatched systems. And ultimately, it's about being able to build the building blocks to articulate these things that are fed by the data that we're used to reporting in, but not necessarily articulating to them in that context. By making sure you've got the data points to back it up if you're saying that we've got a set of risks, for example, right? And it starts with how much risk can you tolerate, right? Can I tolerate a port in New Jersey being shut down for a week? If not, then what can we tolerate? If it's shut down for an hour, is that okay? If it's shut down for a day, is that okay? Right? So that's the business risk we're dealing with. Now, these 8 things are just examples. In the case of that specific port, it's an availability issue, right? So the availability event or the risk might be what level of tolerance do we have for a specific port being shut down for X number of hours? If the tolerance is low, it means you don't want that to happen. If the tolerance is high, then you might say, look, we can probably survive a port being down for an hour. So we've got a high tolerance to it. But if the event is we've got a port shut down for a week, then we've got a low tolerance because we absolutely cannot do business if you've got a port that's unavailable for 7 days. So understand what the risk you're managing and what your tolerance levels are for each. That is actually how you articulate what you want to care about or why it matters and how important it is. And then secondarily, quantify the financial impacts, right? If a port, so if you take availability again, if a port is shut down for an hour, what does that cost us? If a port is shut down for a week, what does that cost us? So if you're able to articulate that and you've got a real dollar figure, and what is the impact? Is it major? Is it minor? There's normally a risk framework in each company to be able to marry a financial impact to whether it's a major or minor issue, right? It's really being able to get down to these in terms of the impact and tolerance you have. And then once you figure that out, you have to understand what the exposure you currently have. So, okay, if we can only tolerate, if we have a low tolerance for a port being unavailable for X amount of time, what is our current exposure? Like, is it highly likely that that's going to happen to us right now, or is it very low risk of that happening right now? And that requires a good level of understanding for how susceptible we are to a specific cyber event that will shut down a port, right? What is our system availability risk for a port being shut down? Is it in the red? Is it in the orange? Is it in the yellow? Is it in the green? And on the flip side, what are our capabilities for that event that will mitigate that risk? So if you've got a really, really high risk of something happening, then we can put certain levels of capabilities in place. This happens to be an example of some capabilities that we might measure in cybersecurity: our ability to manage our assets, our governance, the ability to manage risk, our supply chain, all very relevant to cyber no matter what you're doing. So what level of capability do we need to make sure that our risk of a port being shut down for a week is low or medium as opposed to high? If you use an everyday analogy, I mean, our current situation for the pandemic is every time you go out, you're actually managing risk, right? So I'm managing risk of catching COVID if I'm not vaccinated, if I don't wear a mask, if I touch everything around and then touch my face and touch my eyes. So that's a real risk. I can mitigate that risk by actually wearing a mask. I can mitigate that risk by being vaccinated. I can mitigate risk by not touching anything. So those are controls. So in the cyber world, these are literal controls I can put in to mitigate certain risks. And certain controls will be directly related to the risks that we're managing. So if I'm talking about a port being shut down for a week, then we need to be able to figure out which other capabilities or controls we can put in place to mitigate directly the risk that a port will be shut down, or a ship's control system might be compromised via a cyber attack via the satellite system it might be connected to, or the 3G or 4G tower it might be connecting to in every country it has to go through, right? Those are capabilities and risks that we're managing. And then once you know what risk is susceptible to and what your capabilities are, if there's a gap, then you ultimately need to understand how you're going to get from A to B. This is an example of the kinds of programs that security companies put in or cyber departments put in to mitigate those risks. Data protection, event management, threat and vulnerability programs. And these are all sized to the amount of scope they have to cover and the amount of cost you actually want to put in. So you can actually say, I'm going to reduce my risk of a ship's control systems being mitigated by putting in a risk management and supply chain program that will cost me $2 million to mitigate the risk from high to low, and it's going to cost me X number of dollars. And then that's ultimately the business case, right? It's a business case for change because you're using the right language, using risk, you're talking getting from A to B. And if you listen to me talk, at no point am I actually using any technical language. I'm using plain language, right? And that's the key. And these are the visuals that you need to be able to use to be able to articulate what you're actually managing specifically for the context and the environments that we're talking about in maritime or some other industry that you might be talking about at the point in time. And simple metrics are key. For example, that some organizations boil it down to is 1, 2, 3, or 4 metrics, right? What is our resilience score? Is it a 50? Is it a 20? What's acceptable in the future? Are we trying to get to 70? And then what are the things that feed that resilience score? In this case, it's quite commonly going to be a combination of a risk, the maturity of the capabilities that we have, and the programs that we're putting in place to get from A to B. And this is an example, but it's actually a real example from real environments of how most organizations start to be able to use the metrics and the data points they have in place, fed from real data points in security operation centers and cyber plans and cyber measurements and cyber KPIs, to bring it up to something that a board or an executive is going to care about. And beyond that, you've actually got to make the way you do this repeatable, right? Because if you can't make it repeatable, all you're going to be able to do at any point in time is say, well, the last time we measured it was 6 months ago, and these are the numbers. I don't actually know what it is now, so we can't really ascertain what our exposure to it is right now, especially when you're dealing with things like really shutting down your operations in terms of your logistics business for 1, 2, 3 weeks, which might cost you $300 million if you've not actually got a good view of what risks are right now, so you know what to spend to be able to mitigate your top priority risks that you want to be able to address right now. And given the threat landscape being as dynamic as it is, it's critical in cyber when it comes to digital that you've got this repeatable process. So you've got point in time, near real time visibility of all the things that I'm talking about, and have the one pager ready, right? So boards are used to seeing one pages, things we call balanced scorecards. So if you Google balanced scorecards, you'll have balanced scorecards for KPIs for almost any business metric, right? Customer retention, revenue increase, ability to have KPIs around how quickly a ship can get from A to B, and the efficiency of cost to get there, and the objectives you're trying to get, the cost to put an improvement plan in place to achieve those efficiencies, and when we're going to get there. Now, if you apply these balanced scorecards to cyber, these are the kinds of things that most cyber maturity and good cyber programs have in place. They measure the cyber in these lenses, and they use specific things like risk, reducing risk, and improving capability as real objective they're trying to measure. Then they'll have current and target scores they're going to get there, and a cost to get from A to B, literally on one page, right? The ability to say this is backed up by a repeatable, defensible, real-time ability to get data points to feed this is invaluable, because then you won't get questioned by the executive as to how you got there. They'll know that you have a repeatable way to get there, you're mature enough to get there, and these are backed by measurable algorithmic ways to get there instead of something you made up. And obviously pretty pictures help. So this is a real example of some potential environments that you might be looking at as to how you can actually make it palatable and useful for a board level quality report that you want to get to, right? And it has the same metrics I had on the previous screen, just slightly prettier. And then beyond that, you'll sometimes get asked for detail, right? So these are actual real examples of what kind of details you might be able to provide. So beyond the key resilience metrics, normally boards and execs want to know, okay, what are you proud of? Like, what are you doing well in? And what are some areas of concern? Now, wins are great because they can say and prove that the money they gave a security team is actually getting the outcome or getting towards the outcome they're trying to get to. So in this example, they reduced defacement risk by X percentage, and maturity of the ability to detect a cyber breach went up by 2.2, right? So that's a good thing. Areas of concern are also important because they want to know, generally in plain language, how can we help you if there's ways we can help you, right? So in this case, certain risk, system misuse risk came down by not by as much. Now, if system misuse risk happens to be something that's on their agenda right now, then they might say, look, how do we make that go down by even more the next time we check in with you? That's actual conversation you can have. We often hear security leaders say us, look, all they want is an ability to have an informed conversation with their board and execs around cyber that doesn't have them being dismissed out of impatience because they don't understand what you're saying. So everything you see here is very digestible and very, very much plain language, so that you can have an informed discussion over, okay, is system misuse a key concern because we expected to reduce that risk by 50% and we only got 31%, or is system misuse an increased threat vector that's currently happening in terms of the cybercriminal activity that's happening this month, and we need to increase it by more to reduce that specific risk because of a heightened level of threat landscape that is prevalent right now. That's a discussion you can have. And then beyond that, they want to know, okay, what other risks are we managing? They're very used to looking at things like this risk heat map. and then ability to reduce risk by a certain percentage are usually important. Again, there's nothing here that's very technical, and it's very visually understandable by them to know we're not quite where we need to get to, and we're currently there. Is yellow good? Is yellow bad? Are we comfortable with that? And then how else can we get better? Like, what have we improved by how much over this time period? And in terms of our get well plan, like, how is our actual project governance going, right? So your ability to predict and report on, we're spending X amount, we're generally a bit behind schedule. In this case, we're behind schedule because there's some things in red. How can you get more things in the green? It's a good discussion to have, and it doesn't necessarily need to get technical. And then if you're able to predict forward where we're going to get to, then you're also able to have a discussion over, look, is this enough? If it's not enough, why or why not? And do we have to course correct right now? Or are we happy with where we're going to get to? That's where the projection and predictability using real data points is really, really useful. And then ultimately, when will we get there? Like, are we going to get to risk tolerance and an acceptable risk position or cyber resilience position by the end of 2021? Or is it going to take a little bit longer because of the complexity or the size of our environment? Is it a 2022 kind of thing? They just want an ability for you to be able to say, it will take amount of time. This is the roadmap to get there. Here are the costs. You're predicting every 3 months forward as to what they're going to look like. And it's going to cost $2.3 million to get there, right? Now, an interesting discussion cyber people always have is like, how do we ask for more money, right? If you're saying we're going to get there in 6 months, but it's not really where we committed to, you need to build a business case for more money, right? So you need to be able to come with a plan to say, this is why we need an extra 500K, for example. And it's going to take a data protection program to get there because we want to get our system availability risk from the projected 35% to about 20%. We need to get an extra X amount, and it's going to cost 500K to get there. And you also need to be able to come with options. If you don't get your extra 500K, what does a 250K spend look like? Can we get to maybe 25% instead of 20%, right? These are all business cases that you need to be able to present to a decision maker if you're going to ask for money. And if the decision is we're not going to get there and it's not going to be enough, or if it's simply it's enough and we don't need to spend more, that's also a good thing. And here are just some examples of some business case options to articulate what the previous screen looked like. So if we're using the analogy of the cyber resilience score, you can talk about, okay, here's what a $2.45 million spend looks like. Here's what a 675K spend looks like. And here's what a 500K spend looks like. And that will get us very different results. And here is what we recommend. But if we don't want to spend as much, here are a couple of options. And the ability to actually have a plain language defensible discussion around these things is very, very valuable. And it's proven time and time again that no matter what industry you're in, this is the view you need to be able to talk at to be able to get the budget that you need, that the executives and the non-cyber decision makers need to be able to understand what you're trying to ask for, why you're asking for it, and the money you need to get from A to B. Now, here are some key takeaways. I'm going to allow some time for questions if there are any. But ultimately, here's a slide to remember. Understand that it is a language of risk, impact, capabilities, and outcome that a cyber team needs to be able to articulate. And if you're a board member or a non-cyber executive, these are the things you need to be able to force your cyber team to be able to communicate to you in, for you to have a common language understanding of what they're producing and what they're trying to get to, so that you can make a data-driven, informed decision as to what you're actually managing against. Like, is it the ship control system that's the weak point? Is it the ports that we're managing? If it's the ports, which ports? How long can that port be down for versus that other port in China, or that one in Russia, or that one in London versus the one in New Jersey? Investment ultimately is driven by risks and financial impacts. Regulatory requirements I didn't really touch on a lot, but that absolutely drives spend as well. Every board has a fiduciary and accountable responsibility to meet regulatory requirements. So that is a useful device, but that's not the only device that gets from A to B. It's ultimately about that, wrapped by the risk that you're managing and real business impact and the trends that you're trying to manage against. And then finally, there has to be logical, defensible ties between the metrics being tracked and reported on and what's being asked for and what's being measured, because otherwise there's no real way to be able to arrive at the right middle ground to communicate cyber between the security leaders and the business leaders, to be able to hopefully make sure that no company or no maritime operation ever gets to the point where they have an incident like MERS that cost them $250 to $300 million simply because they weren't necessarily properly managing the cyber risks that they were exposed to at that point in time.